African American writers, other writers, all women writers, especially all over the world, they've always said a very similar thing, that I didn't find myself in the stories I was reading. So while there was a lot written on Kashmir from Kashmiris, non-Kashmiris, uh, but for a girl to grow up in the most uh, important event in the contemporary Kashmir of in the contemporary history of Kashmir hadn't been recorded anywhere. And to be honest, you've read the book and you've written about it as well. I feel it goes beyond the genre memoir, to be honest. For the lack of a better word, it's memoir. But it's rarely it really fits in the autobiographical space. There are 9 chapters. I mean, there are 36 chapters in total, but there are only 9 chapters about me and how I change and how I cope and how I combat. But there are 14 chapters about other women, whether they're my friends, whether they're my aunts, whether they're neighbors, whether they're someone we know. So it's really about, I would like to quote Nadine Gordimer here. She talks about witness literature, and she talks about how it's essentially the inward testimony of that person who is in the middle of these events. And what they come out with is actually witness literature, which is beyond the immediacy of the day. One would argue and say, okay, then you have journalists and you have photojournalists and you have video journalists recording what's happening, but they're really presenting the time and the task and on the day of, on that particular day. With witness literature, you go a little beyond. You locate these experiences. You see what. So writing this memoir, see, I'm not someone who's had like a bureaucratic career, and I mean, for me, memoir gets associated with extraordinary lives, people who've lived, have decades of experience and a strategy behind them. But it was about a young girl and locating her in that landscape, political landscape, cultural landscape, and how those things transformed when Kashmir transformed overnight, literally. So it was really, I wanted to write a novel because I wanted to write. I had this compelling need to write, and it was not really letting me do much with my life other than just keep thinking about it. But I think novel as a genre was taking me into a very different space, and I was not very happy with that. So with this, it was about locating a time in Kashmir which doesn't exist anymore. There were lots of, like, when I'm sorry, I'm sort of intermingling I know there are like 3 specific things one has to talk about, but I'm sort of, they're overlapping. So I'm talking about writing about a time when things changed in Kashmir's time, right? So whether there were rituals, whether there were traditions, whether there were things that had existed in Kashmir for decades, for centuries, those changed. The very obvious thing for a young girl was how the stories changed. Songs changed. Songs became very interchangeable with singing at the funeral and singing at the wedding. It created a strange kind of confusion in a young girl's mind. You are suddenly questioning, you're not at that point questioning, but in retrospect, you keep thinking, it's like death and tragedy and celebration, how they get intermingled. I think when you talk about Kashmir from an insider's perspective, then you see that how these things overlap and how they're so connected. And every time you hear news on Twitter, you read something, and instead, I mean, I've seen people when if there's an encounter, especially, and houses are being burned down after that. And one of my aunt lost her house early in the 90s. And it's instead of empathy, what I see is people are questioning, oh, good riddance, and this happened. And but when you see from where I was as a young girl, as a young woman, they were all intermixed. It was like, so it's not, the militarization is not only on the borders, but it enters your homes, it enters your psyche. I mean, that's the first thing. And the city changes, and your relationship with the city changes, and especially if you're growing up as a young girl in a conservative society, there is another layer of do's and don'ts. There is a war etiquette suddenly that you have to know, and these things go unnoticed because this is never going to make a newspaper headline. It's never going to make news on it's never going to generate the kind of TRPs that other news sort of generates. So it resonated with what Svetlana Alexievich sort of speaks about in her book about Unwomanly Face of War, of how women's wars have like colors, and they have feelings, and they have a very different sensation, which rang really true to where I was and when I was writing. Because you see outside, someone gets killed, someone loses a limb in a blast, and there is a certain heroism that's happening on the streets, but and the moral courage that it takes to get by what's happening on the streets and survive and try to live as ordinarily as possible. It just needed a very different kind of courage. And I'm not saying I was courageous or something like that. I mean, it was just like a lot of people like me were just trying to get by. And as a result, you see the mental health that we are looking at in Kashmir in, 2016, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, did a report where they said at least 45% of Kashmiris are suffering from some serious psychological disorder. I picked up this book, Sahiba Hussein's Love, Loss and Longing in Kashmir, and she also speaks about how she's spoken to many psychiatrists, etc., who've given her the same thing. And I think what basically one forgets is beyond what's happening on the streets, beyond what someone living in a conflict zone uh, deals with, women's coping mechanisms, I felt, are very diverse and very unique to what happens to them. So I understand, let's say, a half widow whose husband has been disappeared. She has a lifelong battle, to basically look for him and to look for justice. And as we know, there hasn't been a single case that has been resolved there. But there are also women who want to go to school, who want to go to colleges, but there are barriers, and there are, you have to basically navigate your life in an extremely militarized space. So this is something that I didn't find, in any piece of literature anywhere. So, and also how I was, in the first few years, I was a fearful young adult, young woman. But eventually, I mention it in the book somewhere, too much fear can also catapult into fearlessness. And then I just became this, at least the facade was, I would just go out. I started, there's this instance in the book which I mentioned, in the metallic monster, and there used to be the steel monster, who would just attack people. And I used to actually wash my school uniform at night and go out on the porch to hang it at 9:30 at night. And my mom used to be like, are you out of your mind? What are you doing here? What if it attacks you? But I think I was slowly trying to reclaim the spaces. And as opposed to another cousin of mine who had actually gathered a group of girls in her neighborhood, and they wanted to go to the UN office with a memorandum, in the early 90s. And she eventually ended up leading a very ordinary life. She has 3 kids now. She's teaching in a college. So just between the two of us, and another aunt of ours who'd lost her home, and she started saluting the paramilitary that used to patrol outside our home at 5:30. So suddenly you have just 3 women, which is not even the tip of the iceberg. It's like really minuscule sample that you look at, and how everyone is coping in a very different way. All the experiences are so unique. So, but when one reads the reports or Kashmir as an intellectual idea, I mean, there's a certain homogeneity in the experiences. I mean, as if they all suffer the same way. They don't. And that is, I think, that sort of tells you that, you see, you see, when you see the kind of atrocities that you see, that is strategic, and that's sort of, that comes from the state with a certain message. But then you also see what's been written, and unless you have another perspective on that, I just felt like it was lacking in the texture, to be honest. When it comes to people living in conflict zones, you just fine. You're talking about dwarfing of humanity, of what happens there, but you're almost like, when you say trauma in Kashmir, you think everyone is suffering from the same thing. Everyone is depressed. I used to be a student of psychology, and I used to go for field work back home. And what we used to study in the books was so different from what I used to see back there. I mean, having said that, I was also on medication for a while till I read up, and that's another story. And but I think the only person I used to see depressed in that institution was the doctor. He was like just quietly used to be sitting in one corner, and everyone else was just exhibiting such different symptoms. And therefore, I also sort of, in a way, not challenge, in a way challenge in the book that it's not PTSD. It's like a perennial, it's not post-trauma, it's perennial trauma, stress disorder. I mean, for me and people who have resources have managed to sort of have a semblance of some semblance of life. You seek therapy. I have been a student of psychology. One is aware, one writes, one tries to be as normal as you can. But something happens back home, or when I'm there, and it all comes crumbling down. So it's there's no post really. So coming back to the experiences that people have there, I remember there was this guy. He had doctors had diagnosed him as schizophrenic, and we were talking to him, and he was just changing personalities within like between 11 and 17 seconds. And if someone else saw him, and then we would come back to the class with notes, etc., and then teachers would be like, I mean, they would be like, we see a very completely different picture. It's just not what we read in the books. So that is at the academic level also. I think people, when you think of people living in conflict zones, or for example, let's say when we see refugees, and I mean, I'm thinking of Afghan crisis right now, when these people leave homes and the way they leave, or the ones who are left behind, not everyone is going to have the same kind of fear. Everyone is going to experience it very differently. I think it becomes suddenly very important to understand those, and the heroism that resides in those experiences to get by through the day. It was a very odd thing for me to revisit those days in times of pandemic, not because one was locked in, etc., but how windows reminded me of those days. So windows were the only, I mean, I used to sometimes stand outside in the balcony or look out, and there used to be people standing at the windows, and there was construction going on, so that you would have a guy who was working, the construction worker, you would have a neighbor who was feeding her child. And it reminded me of how we couldn't open the windows, and how windows sort of turned into walls. And I remember my grandmother, for her, and she was old and she would rarely go out, for her the only connection to the world was through the windows. And when the windows were shut, because she had chronic asthma, which was exacerbated by tear gases, her world completely changed. The windows became completely shut for about a year and a half. We wouldn't open them. And in the old city of Kashmir, windows are largely like wood planks, very ornate wood planks. and you have like window pane, like glass panes, small ones, because it gets very cold, so it keeps us warm. Shutting that, because you rarely see light coming in, so it's like you're living in a vertical cell, and then you're only letting in, and there used to be certain times, certain days where we would observe blackout, right? So then even those the glass panes would be covered. So what happens to people? So it's when you think of curfew, when you think of home being the safe refuge from curfew, and here you're seeing that even that doesn't really guarantee any kind of safety. Or for example, it was a very, I mean, curfew it's not the pandemic curfew we're talking about. We're talking about a jeep coming in repeatedly, periodically, in your neighborhood and saying that it's shoot at sight order. So I think that works on your psyche in such a way that you're scared to step out even into your courtyard. What if you make a sound? You have to be like very disciplined, and the only thing is, I mean, you can't make noise, you can't. So curfew sort of tames everything, your behavior, how much should you laugh? How much should you be normal? How much should you, I mean, it as if enters with air. And that's what I mean when I say that militarization of domestic spaces, that you can't restrain these things, and you can't sort of say, fine, there's curfew, I'll stay home and I'll play music. I mean, and it's not just me, a lot of my friends of my age, we just cannot play music too loud, because it's like, there's a fear. Or you don't play TV, you don't turn up the volume of the TV. So those things are very and difficult to sort of imagine. And the fear, and there are like, before 1990, when insurgency erupted, followed by that heavy militarization, you had different, I mean, when I think of that life, and I was pretty young, I mean, even though there were curfews before, because Kashmir has never been normal, so to speak. There was rigging of elections in 87, 88. Before that, there was a cricket match, which was played in Kashmir, which I talk about in the book, which is called The Courtyard Graffiti. So it's always been restive. And in fact, there was one of the guys who was arrested during that cricket match, because there were some young boys who had taken to the stadium and had dug the pitch and said it's a disputed territory, you cannot host international matches, etc. here. And so and of course then that would, and before that, I'm like sort of going back into the 80s now. Before that, there was this film called Lion of Desert, which was released at Omar Mukhtar, and it showed basically Libyan revolutionary resistance of the Italian occupation. So then there were protests, anti-Sheikh Abdullah protests at that point. So even in my 80s, I do have a very like vague ideas of that it was, there were like periods of, Kashmir has seen these periods of lull and then eruption, lull and eruption. And the 90s was like a full-blown thing. Yeah, and to sort of, then this memoir sort of, I started locating both the experiences or the remembrances of 80s and place them where I was placed in the 90s, which was like really in the interior of the city, the old city of Srinagar. Yeah, so that's what I thought.
Thank you so much, Farah, for sort of sharing your experience, of growing up in Kashmir, and sort of such a personal sort of, account of what it was to what it is to grow up as a Kashmiri, and especially grow up as a young girl in Kashmir. I mean, as I think usually, we try not to hierarchize perspectives, okay? But usually I think what one sees is either apathy or too much of an intellectualization of the issue, like you pointed out. And then to have, this sort of a perspective where you come across the lived experience of of a person who's grown up through that, I think that's quite something for all of us here. And I think especially for the many students, youngsters who are present, and even for us, I think it teaches us more than anything else to think about the kind of privileges that we have, that we take for granted, which to some extent has been, we've been sensitized to that to a very little extent thanks to the pandemic, but still, we still lead very, very privileged lives. And before I move on to the questions, I must say this, because we are, this is a memoir we are talking about, and therefore I guess it's all right to talk, about share some personal experience. I've been to Kashmir just once, and one of the moments that stands out for me during that trip, and this was not obviously not when the whole in the 90s when things were pretty bad, but this was early. This was about 2001, 2002, so things hadn't dramatically improved either. So we were out, and I think this was our last evening in Kashmir, and we were. It was afternoon, actually. It was not even evening. And we were coming back after a meal, me and my husband. And we suddenly remembered that, we need to pick up some, dry fruits or some things for our friends, relatives back home. And we stopped at Lal Chowk. We were in an auto rickshaw. And my husband got down to go and, get it. And I was sitting in the auto because, we thought it will be just quicker if we do that. And the moment, and we didn't think, because these are things we do naturally, normally in a city like Delhi, one person gets off, it's not you don't necessarily put a lot of thought behind it. And I remember after he got out of the auto rickshaw to get these, dry fruits, I was absolutely struck by panic. I thought, this is a place where blasts happen all the time. This is what regular life is. And that is the moment that has stayed with me, the absolute state of panic till, he came back, and I was, assured that, everything's all right, we are safe. And I have grown up in Assam, where, I'm not, not used to violence, bomb blast, etc. were pretty much a part of my life growing up in Assam. And despite that, this is something I had never, ever felt, never, ever experienced. So to live with that, I can only begin to imagine, the trauma, and the scars that it would have sort of, left behind. Well, coming back to a little more, yes, people do please post your questions in the chat box, and yes, and we'll take them up in a bit. There has been quite a bit of writing coming out of Kashmir of late, especially in the last decade or so. How do you explain that? Is there a greater need to sort of, tell your story, or there's a greater space available, or is it just a generational thing that, now you feel much more, like you were saying, there's a certain fearlessness? Is that it? How do you explain this sort of, volume of writing coming out of Kashmir?
I think it's so two things to this. A is when you see that what's being spoken about, and there's a gulf between the way it's presented sometimes and the way it actually happens. So it's also about reclaiming that voice and wanting to tell your own stories, So I see a lot of Kashmiris, and all of us have this on Facebook, on social media. They'll have this African proverb plastered on their profile saying, "Unless the lion learns how to tell their story, the hunter will always glorify it." So that is one thing, reclaiming the space to tell the stories. And second is, there's a sense of there is this impending sense of impending erasure of identity, an assault on identity. And in that sense, you want to do things you can to preserve it. Some people take up cooking, some people dress up overtly to wear it on their sleeve, literally. Some people take to writing. So there are different extent people, like there's a huge culture of music right now in the last few years which has come up, your rappers. And so you had MC Cash, who was one of the rappers who wrote songs like in 2000, after the Intifada was 2010, 11. So those became, it's about voice, and writing is an medium of expression. People who can write will write. People who can make music, they will make music. People who want to express through art. So it's just that they, whatever comes naturally to them.
Why not a novel? Because you do talk about it, you talked about it now also. Why this choice of a memoir? Is it a conscious sort of, even a political choice to write in a genre that, that in some ways it interrogates what is perceived as literature itself, in that sense, it's a genre that women's writing is advocates in some ways, it privileges the memoir, the diary. So is that a conscious choice to write a memoir and not a novel or a collection of short stories?
Sure. When I was writing the novel, and I had to, obviously, books come out of either books or they come out of life experiences. And if I was going to write a novel and fictionalize it from my life experiences, which were far more dramatic than my imagination. So I just thought let's be true to it. I mean, when I was writing the novel, I was first writing about 4 boys. And I was like, no, and I was trying to. And then I realized I've been writing this book for a long time. But I used to call these chapters fillers. Like, these are going to just help my big narrative that's going to fall into place someday. When I started examining these, and they were like, in my head, I thought, no. And what happened is, I think it's also the exposure one has to the world literature at large. And then you read literature from, let's say, places which have had a similar historical background. And, it opens up your own mind that you can go beyond novel, and, you can. So I thought, and I think it was also, at some level, I was uncomfortable in writing novel about a woman. I was like, I just didn't want to fictionalize it. I just wanted to say as it was, So just to stay true to those experiences, to honor the memory of, and the resilience and the courage of so many girls who grew up at that time. I didn't want to fictionalize it. I think it was, in that sense, becomes a political choice.
That makes sense. There's also a certain orality in the telling of the memoir. So it's almost like you're sitting around and you're sort of telling stories. This happened. It's full of digressions, and there are backstories given to characters people that you come across, not characters. So again, is that something? Is that conscious? This orality? Do you try to sort of bring the sense of a story being just told to a bunch of friends or people listening to you? Because that's the sense that comes across.
I try to, like I said, I try to stay true to that young girl who, in fact, someone asked me, why didn't you use terms like we know about mental health now? And even though you've been a student of psychology, I was like, I wanted to write before I knew what I knew. So it was really going back to that girl. And because there was this tradition of Ramzan Kak, who was, one of the one of the family members, he was the storyteller. And he used to, in the book, my father, when he had this shop, and Ramzan Kak used to go and, go to these villages and etc. It would come back not only with things, but tons of stories. And I used to really look forward. I think that was one space of stability in my life at that point, which completely changed after the 90s. But I think that worked as an anchor for this book. For, to be able to write, you need to sit somewhere. You have to have that little space of stability. And I think that orality, which you talk about, was this little anchor of stability from where I could write. Yeah.
Also, again, it's episodic. It's in some ways it's fragmented, disjointed, and you get slivers of lives, various lives. and you do not get a complete story. Is it again sort of because there are no complete stories, our stories end abruptly, stories are interrupted, at any critical time? Is that what was also playing through your mind?
Two things again. When I'm recounting, so if you really see, there's like two narratives running in the chapters. So I have given more space to setting the context, and then suddenly when that fracture happens and what happens, post 90s, it was to mimic that 1 hour that had completely changed the face of Kashmir as we knew it. My sister and I, we walk into a salon, we come back, and everything has changed. We had gone for a haircut, and by the time we came out, there was fighting, and a 12-year-old cousin who was my age had been killed. And so, I was trying to mimic that fracture throughout. Second was, memory is, like you said, it's fragmented, it's episodic. So I again wanted to, there were a lot of things I wanted to stay true to in this. And that was also like some memories which came very easily and some were very painful, to the extent that I have never experienced panic attacks in sleep before. And after the first 8 chapters, I started getting panic attacks in sleep. And I used to have recurring dreams. So it was again basically staying, how does, it's also like in the larger context of memory and identity. So how do you like, do you present memory consciously, or do you sort of represent memory the way it comes to you? So I was sort of exploring that as well in this.
So with, I think, most narratives of violence, we always sort of see the cyclical nature of violence, and that's true of your memoir too, where, for example, in the, I think, Nasir and Nasreen story that you talk about, you see how the husband, who himself is a victim of violence, then becomes an abusive husband. But that apart, I was also very, very intrigued by the character, or the character of, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Koal. Cole, okay, Cole, who's challenged, physically challenged. So, and I think I'm sure it's a conscious decision, because that's a very different perspective about trauma and violence and daily coping strategies that someone like him would have to adopt.
So, yes, I mean, both the people you spoke about, Cole was deaf mute, and Nasir was, he had an injury, so to his head in the childhood, and that sort of impaired his cognitive abilities. So again, now when you take women, keep women aside, you also have these men in the book. Again, two men with very different responses, right? So again, I think it's like adding another shade or texture or layer to how people cope with conflict, how they react. Because Nasir didn't know, as a result, right now, as we speak, they have no woman left in their house. I mean, another brother had a divorce. So I don't know what his story was. What led to their divorce? Was that what was conflict in a way, a trigger, or what happened really? Because, and then their mother passed away and Nasir's wife died. So again, you're talking about differently able people, who are not, again, what we see in media or what we see in books. These are people who are, you would call them the marginalized in a society, and how was Cole ever going to tell his story? How would his perspective ever come to the fore? Which reporter would go and, I mean, because they don't speak in sign languages. He was who came from a poor background. So we had invented that language with him of certain gestures, what meant what. So yeah, I mean, it's like how conflict sort of and militarization is that, etc., affects them. People who don't have forget about the agency. This is about basic cognitive skills, or yeah.
And it's not just somebody who's mute and who cannot sort of articulate their thoughts. You talk about not the inability to share grief.
Oh,
Okay,
yes.
for example, I think there's a little episode where you talk about her friend's father has been
Father was killed.
abducted and killed. Okay, and you cross her, and you're unable to convey any condolence message or give her a hug or any of that. So what happens with this inability to, this kind of self-silencing in a way that happens, what kind of impact does it have, this inability? There are so many of you in that same sort of situation, yet unable to share that grief.
I think that was my coping, and which sort of is true till date, that I don't know, for me, these things are like, when I visualize it, it's like a wound. I just don't want to go and touch that wound on that person and sort of, like just evoke something. It The same thing happened when my cousin was killed, and I couldn't cry at his funeral either. So what do you say? Like, how, because the nature of killing has been so brutal. Rabia saw her father being riddled with bullets from head to toe. I mean, he was lying there in the pool of blood. Or my cousin who was killed and his throat was slit. And there was another cousin who lived nearby, where at the site where they were killed, and they were dragged down. How do you console the mother of a son, or like, I mean, what do you say to them? I mean, do you say, I don't know. I mean, it's just the nature of those killings is so brutal, that you feel like they have already been wounded. These people who have been left behind. What are you going to tell them? And as a result, I don't know if it's fear, if it's, I don't think as a young girl, it was the sophistication. I think I just had no vocabulary. There's really, I mean, it just like leaves you speechless, literally.
You also talk about children, for example, who obviously impacted by all that's happening around. In various ways you see them impacted, but you also talk about how they would enact scenes of an encounter as play.
Oh, yes.
Do you think then, to some extent, violence is normalized? What happens with how they deal with violence?
See, when uh, I'll tell you this. There's this my niece when she was 2.5, 1.5 in 2013, and Afzal Guru was hanged. And few days later, my sister called and she's like, "You have to hear what she does." And she was not like panicking. My sister, I mean, she was like basically thinking like, "What has she picked up?" She was amused in a way. She's like, she takes the cord of the iron and puts it around her neck and says, "Mujhe phansi do." This is 1.5-year-old child,
Gosh.
almost like how whichever way she can say, mujhe phansi do. And so it's not normalization, but it's what you see around you. I mean, that also, what do children play in normal societies? House, ghar kar, becoming parents, having dolls, marriages of their dolls, or being, but and what they see the kids in the society, and that's what they do. So there's that chapter on the games we play. And recently I met both the brothers, Ahmed and Umar, where the Umar had played a prank on
Yeah.
Ahmed, basically by sort of abducting him with a twig.
Yeah.
And we laugh about these things, but it's like, oh my God, how stupid could you be? And you couldn't tell the difference between the rifle poke and the poke of a twig. It's not normalized, but that's all you see in the society, and that's a reflection of the reality.
What were some of your coping mechanisms that you adopted as a child and which kind of helped you to deal with what was going on?
I think multiple things. I started pulling out my hair, for
Yeah.
starters, on the day insurgency erupted and my cousin was killed. And that habit continued, which I sometimes relapse into when there's a situation that I really can't handle. Uh, that continued for 28 years. Then music used to be something that really used to help me distract. Going to shrines was like a very big thing for me. And reading. So these 3, 4 things, depending on what really came in handy. So there was not a like a conscious decision of, I'm going to cope with this. Whatever you could sort of find at that point was, if it was listening to radio and listening to music. So yeah, I mean, no single strategies, so to speak.
Because
I mean,
it's
now
such
I
a
know, because now I know that if I don't do any physical exercise, it will impact me adversely. At least now I'm aware that as a 16, 15-year-old.
yeah. Uh, you talk about the heroism of those who are survivors, but do you also feel this kind of heroism is something that they didn't ask for? It is imposed on them, and therefore does it sort of invite us to look at the idea of heroism itself in a different way?
See, I wasn't trying to sort of. I was saying what it's extra. It's not ordinary. It's extraordinary in a way. And sure, they didn't ask for it, but I was talking it in the more in the context of how it's underreported, how these experiences are actually form the chunk of the population. This is where there is this concept. I think Teju Cole speaks about it. There is hot violence and there's cold violence. The entire apparatus of cold violence actually reflects is what hot violence is like. So that hot violence is on the streets and there's war and there's everything. But the way it impacts ordinary people, you can gauge what that is through this in a way.
Yeah. Do you think the pandemic and our being under lockdown and all of that has somehow enabled in any which way to understand what goes on in Kashmir on an everyday level? It has made us more able to understand it better in any way. Do you think it has facilitated that, any kind of empathy, more empathy, or you think no, nothing has changed?
No, I do see people have been empathetic in the sense. To be honest, I wasn't expecting the kind of response the book got. I think that in itself is a testimony that people are looking at it sensitively. Pandemic, the lockdowns, and not being able to have any control. I think more than the lockdown, it was like feeling helpless, feeling uncertain, feeling not having that ability. I mean, you lose your agency in the face of a small virus. Now you see if the streets are threatened and your life is threatened, then it somehow makes a lot of people sort of think what it could be like, though they may not be able to imagine the enormity of it. But no, I have seen response which has been very it's been full of empathy. So yeah, I wouldn't really discount. And of course, then there are like people who would be like, oh, but largely it's touched people.
So one last question, because I think there are a lot of people who are posting questions and I think they should get a chance. Did you practice any kind of self-censorship while writing this, given how, the mention of the K word, the kind of censorship that it invites, the kind of trolling and backlash it invites? Did it make you sort of practice any kind of self-censorship?
No, because I was very sure that I was going to write about things that I was going to write about. And if it meant the book didn't get published, I was okay with that. So if it like stayed in my drawer for the rest of my life, it was all right. It did, since it's a memoir, it went through 3 legal readings at HarperCollins. Yeah. So the first one came in and they were like, there are as many instances where you can be tried for sedition. But my editor was she believed in this. And she said, so we added citations everywhere. And so there is during the last reading for Haval massacre, the legal said, if it didn't happen, drop it. And that is probably the chapter which has the highest number of citations from last 30 years, whatever, 30 years now, 31 years. So no censorship from my side.
So nowadays we need to do a sedition check as well while publishing. Wonderful. On that note, I think I'll hand it over to Harsh and you can sort of take the questions, Harsh. And I think a couple of people have raised their hands. See if you can I think they can just unmute and ask. I think if there's a problem, I'll unmute it. Prerna, I think you want to, maybe we'll start with, and then Harsh can take over. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, Prerna, can you unmute and speak? You wanted to ask a question, I think. Chinglu, can you unmute and speak?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm from the department itself, and thank you for such an insightful talk. I had a wonderful time reading Rumors of Spring, yet at the same time, it had brought back a lot of trauma to me because I grew up from the Northeast, and we have similar instances about the bunkers setting up everywhere, the heavy militarization, the questions asked to ordinary people, the curfews, and we call all the military army, and they can barge in any of the houses whenever they pleases, and the crackdown that you talk about in your book. So, and people being arrested and uh, burning them alive, and also pouring hot water over them and all of that. So I was wondering if you could now, Shubhani also had already asked you, but if you could elaborate a little bit about this perennial trauma that we have as a community, and how much do you draw from this, or by after your writing, do you also feel the trauma of your younger years growing up? Do you have to go through it all over again, or has it healed you in some way? Could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Thank you, Chinglu. Thanks for reading the book, and thanks for making this, drawing the parallel, and raising this question. I completely understand, and I think for once I can say I can completely empathize with what you have gone through and what people in your hometown are going through. To your question, has it helped me with that perennial trauma? Like I was telling Shibani earlier, if something happens, whatever, no matter how many coping mechanisms I have created, if something happens, and it happens very closely, right? So when 2019, the abrogation happened, and we were not allowed, landlines were cut off, and internet was cut off, and people were literally holed up inside. And somebody, my sister had to get medicine or something, and she had gone out, and she'd also bumped into two more cousins, and they had told her they were going to a funeral of a particular family. They said Vaniyu ke ghar pe. These families who belong to Vanis. And she came back and she told mom, someone has died. So we spent, in the Vani family, we spent 2 days wondering who it could be, because they didn't give accurate information. So then that starts the whole, you're like trying to wonder, oh, okay, who was the closest to death, who was unwell, who could have died, and how did they die? Was it through a bullet? So this uncertainty, I think it's not basically whether one has reached a point of closure, but what does one do with, see, post means there has been some kind of truth, reconciliation, and some sort of closure, but this uncertainty prevails. And I'm talking about something as fresh as 2019. And then suddenly we kept talking of when the first chapter that I talk about, how my grandmother, about that night or that evening when she didn't know whether we were alive or not. So it suddenly, one trigger can actually reactivate other experiences as well. So I don't really see a closure, so to speak. A lot of people have also asked me, has it been cathartic? But it's only you reach catharsis after some point of closure. After, but if it's ongoing, the assault is ongoing. I don't know how much of cathar you just try to make sense of what is happening and what has happened and what's going to happen. But I don't know if you if the thing is ongoing, you can ever reach that stage. And people like you and I can at least articulate. People like you and I can at least talk about it. But imagine majority of the population who do not a have the agency, not the vocabulary, see how to even put it together, because psychologically when when you're exposed to extreme fear and panic, some parts of your brain can turn numb and they can just stay numb. So I don't know, it's a very tricky situation, to be honest, because I don't know if you ever reach that. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer which is sort of which gives hope, or because it is something that I experienced myself. Yeah, I hope it answers what you'd started.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Not at all.
Yes, Harsh, take the questions now from the chat box, and then we could ask teachers.
Sure,
Harsh, one question can I ask?
sure, ma'am.
Am I audible, Harsh?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, a very good afternoon, Farha, Shibani, and all the students. Um, I haven't read most of the novel, but then of the memoir, but some parts of it, because I was really looking forward to listening to you. I even listened to your interview on YouTube yesterday. And what I could little bit make out of the memoir was uh, the incidents, episodes, etc., that you have narrated. They all figure somewhere in the 90s, right?
That's right.
Right, right. The years when you were a little girl and you were growing up. So obviously, a lot of experiences that you have mentioned, they you must have collected from others' experiences, and there must have been a lot of them. So you must have done some kind of exercise between segregating what are the ones that you would like to include, what you wouldn't want. So what was the criteria, while you went about, and just one simple observation. Um, that time, 89, 90, I was here in Delhi, and that was the time when a lot of affected families were Kashmiri refugees were coming to Delhi. And that is one experience I would like to recount. When I can just say, I mean, going through a memoir and your experiences, I mean, what I'm saying is just it's nothing but something I think I had an idea that, how tough it must have been. There was a girl in this school where I used to teach that time. That was my first school where I went to teach. I was also very young that time. And this girl, she just kept on weeping continuously. And it became very difficult for teachers even to find out what's the problem. And then one day, of course, I went to her, and then we thought some problem is there with her. And then she wouldn't stop sobbing. And then she recounted, she said she had actually seen, all that bomb shelling and tear gas, whatever, the moment they were forced to flee from Kashmir. So obviously, a small girl, barely 10 years old or maybe 11 years old, and how it impacted her mind. So I think that was my first, you can say, the first traumatic experience of somebody gone through that. And I can I am before before I complete it, Farah, I must compliment you. uh, we talk about life, that life is a combination of joy and sorrows, but it's sorry. I mean, we feel sorry for people like you, so many people who've been there, that it has been most of suffering, most of terror, most of torments, most of atrocities, and perhaps a 5% or a 7% of happiness or a ray of hope. So it must have been very, very difficult for you to relive all those memories, your own experiences, and everything that you went through, and come out with this memoir. I must compliment you for that. So just one question I made, and uh, I think,
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Prerna.
yeah,
So did you, the girl, was she Kashmiri Pandit?
I think so. Yeah,
Okay.
I think so.
So to your question,
My question was, I think the question was just how, I mean, what strategy did you apply, or what were you looking forward to when you had to segregate particular incidents in a memoir from the ones that you didn't want to include? I mean, you
I
had to prioritize.
sure.
There must have been so many.
There were the period of the book is basically the period of the memoir is 89 to 94.
Hmm.
For me to segregate, when I wrote these memories, and there was one I couldn't write which I wanted to include, was uh, my aunt who had survived a shootout, a
Hmm.
shooting, and her when she came home, when she reached our place, her shoes, she was wearing rubber shoes. It was spring, like March maybe. And it was, her shoes were making a squelchy sound and there was blood in it. I remember as a child, I obviously didn't ask anything. And by the time I started writing it, she had already passed away. She was my mom's elder sister. And so when I wrote these memories and I spent time with them, and I wanted to include that and I couldn't. And there was, what I realized was the bulk of incidents I've had written about were only till my grandmother's death. So that was the end of 94, December 19th. And I had written a couple more chapters, which were from 98 and 97. And then to make it as it is, it's episodic, it's slightly incoherent, which I
Hmm.
thought will be a huge
Hmm.
challenge for the readers to go back and
Hmm.
forth. I tried to
Hmm.
arrange them year wise, but it didn't really work. Then I used it as a structural device to use my grandmother's funeral as an
Hmm.
anchor
Hmm.
for the reader so that it flows through. So that was the main thing too.
Yeah.
And the memories I had written from 97, 98, I had to drop those. Uh,
Okay.
yes. So it was from a structural point of view, because when you're writing about such, it's not a novel that you have a plot in mind.
Yeah.
You're really trusting your subconscious to give you what it has retained. So it had actually retained till then most of the, I think it was also about when my grandmother, I write about her. She was this really very impressive figure to look at, and
Hmm.
very tall and
Hmm.
broad and very 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 progressive as well. She
Hmm.
really
Hmm.
encouraged girls to study, and she wanted me to be a doctor because she really was really fond of this Pandit girl who was our next door neighbor. She was studying medicine and she used to really like her. So she had this authoritative figure who, when insurgency erupted, she became this very diminutive figure in the house, in a way, because she didn't know anything. Earlier, it was the wisdom that resided in her, and
Hmm.
she sort of
Hmm.
shrank. And it
So
was also
changes.
my way to give her this funeral through the book, which extended overnight, was almost to give her that space that she used to occupy in the house, which 90s took away from so many elders.
Harsh, maybe you could
Thank you.
ask
Thank you
Meenakshi
so
to help
much.
with trust
Okay.
question if she's there.
Sure, ma'am. So, Ma'am, Lakshmi Malhotra is asking that increasingly autobiography is being replaced by the idea and concept of life writing. So, in that context, can witness literature be also be a part of that? Please comment.
It's written here.
If the voice is not clear, I can read
Sure,
it out to
sure,
you. I
yeah.
think increasingly autobiography is being replaced by the idea and concept of life writing, which is an umbrella term. Which is an umbrella term embracing autobiography, biography, memoir, individual and collective. Witness literature could also be a part of that. Please comment, because I think she's also Meenakshi Malhotra teaches she at Hansraj,
Okay.
and we also, not to our honors but to our past course students, we offer a paper in which they do study life narratives.
Okay.
So from that point of view, also perhaps it's an interesting question.
Sure. Thank you, Meenakshi. It was, I mean, like you rightly said, witness literature becomes a subset of autobiographical genre, so to speak, because autobiography, it's basically many things, right? So it's like interpretation primarily. But witness literature, like I was mentioning earlier, goes, I think it's like, it's personal. Second, it goes beyond autobiography, it also includes others into it, so it becomes a little more expansive in that sense. So autobiography can be seen from a person's point of view and a certain perspective that comes from that person. I think witness literature expands it in a way that you also see other people located in that particular landscape, and try and see things from their perspective as well. So I think it works in an internal external kind of a way, where autobiographical as a main genre is largely internal, I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
The next question is that do you think the memoir or first-hand experiences are better historical amounts in the sense that who would have better than the person who lived through it?
I wouldn't say better. uh, I would just say it is an important piece in the overall, in the larger landscape of things, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say better, but I would say important. I would say the memoirs are it gives you I've been a journalist. I know how reports work. I know the way you create a narrative. I've also studied. I've been a student of literature, so I've also written my thesis and papers, etc. So, but in witness literature or in first-hand experiences is basically and that's the whole point of literature, and that's the whole point of that you are able to see different perspectives. So while reporting and academic interests also help you analyze and ask pertinent questions, this just aids that discourse and makes it a little more complete, I feel.
The next question is from Vishrupa.
Before we move on, Prerna, I think you need to mute yourself, otherwise the sound is getting muted. So, except if you are speaking, please mute yourself.
The next question is from Vishrupa. Was writing transparently about real life experiences therapeutic for you on some levels?
I think only at the level of my grandmother's death, but can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Sure. So at that level, because maybe the closure with her, I don't know, but when I still think about sometimes when I read, like when I have to do a reading, I it there's a certain, I don't know how to explain it, but there's when I was writing them, there was this hollowing of the pit in me somewhere, which used to, when I used to write. And I remember a friend of mine was staying with me for a few days. She was finishing her PhD from JNU. And when I used to write, and she would walk in, and I would have written a chapter, and she'd be like, "You look so tired, as if you've like run 20 kilometers." So and when I was writing, and I used to have this strange feeling inside of reliving those experiences. But when I read them again, I think that I still feel the same at some level. Maybe not with that kind of intensity, but moving on, I don't know if it really can happen. Like I see, we'll open the Twitter and you'll see gunfight in Tral, gunfight in Pulwama, so many militants killed. And the semantics, right? The word killing, it's not something that you will ever get away from. It'll still conjure same associations. You will think of certain things the way it happens with food. And I still have a strange, very strange relationship with food, and I still can't eat certain things. So I don't know if it's possible to ever come out of that, to be honest. I mean, that's my experience.
The next question is from Satyendu. Satyendu is asking that what is your general process to write in an initial phase of thinking?
I just write whatever comes to my mind in the first draft. I don't care about grammar. I don't really care about sentence structure. I think that only flows once I'm like relook. So the first time is like I just like write what I know, and then how I know it is then I sort of you think. And usually when I write is and then I will think about that particular, or sometimes when it's not like sometimes you'll have to take breaks while writing and go back to thinking. So it depends on exactly, like right now when I'm working on the group portrait of Kashmiri women from 95 onwards, and this is a novel and this is not a memoir. So but even for that, and it's again inspired by many real life incidents. So I go back and then I've written, let's say, a chapter, and suddenly have to I recently had to write about an engagement, right? Usually it's a time of celebration, but I was trying to remember what did it mean to sort of. So you write that, then there was like otherwise that's the easiest thing to write, right? Marriage or celebration. You have attended so many, but then you go back to thinking, and then you see, okay, how are you going to write and structure it? I hope I answered your question. I digressed a bit on that.
A couple of people have raised their hands, so maybe Bhushan, you could ask your question first, and then Momil.
Yeah,
Bhushan, you could
good
unmute
morning,
yourself.
everyone. Thank you, Farah, for your memoir and lived experiences that you have represented. In fact, voice is always to be heard, and silence is not preferable in the present times. And thank you, Ma'am Shivani, also for conducting this such a wonderful discussion. Farah, it's a question for you, since it's a time of marginalized voices to be heard. And mainly from a feminist perspectives, we have so many. As one of our colleagues said that earlier, there was a weeping story of a child. Maybe that wasn't put into words. And I'm also from a very border area of J&K. We have bunkers here and too many casualties going around all the time. So we all have scars. So, Farah, for you, I have a question that you have written the lives of Kashmiri women, partly it's partially your autobiography, partially the stories of other women of 1990s in Kashmir. If you're asked to write the same book today, the story of Kashmiri women and your autobiography 2020s, how far this story has changed? Or is it the same in the past 30 years? Or there has been a little change or transformation, maybe good or bad, from feminist perspective?
Thank you, Bhushan. Thank you. That's a really wonderful question. Like you said, of course, as societies move and progress, they evolve. But and there is women who. So there are three aspects, actually, layers to it. Young girls definitely are claiming their space. They are exploring many different things. To begin with, in the early 90s, I couldn't have even imagined becoming a journalist. I was out of the question. My parents wouldn't have allowed it, and I was too scared, honestly, to by myself. I didn't know how would I go out and cover protests, because I would most of the times freeze, or a killing, or during a crossfiring or a blast. So that you see changing. You have women who go on encounter sites. So you have photojournalists, reporters who would go and report it. And they sort of are reclaiming that space. But there's also, and then there is women are exploring art. So definitely women are reclaiming their space, which is a great thing. But the conflict also further can marginalize the marginalized. It can marginalize, because people, it's not always, it's not we're not talking about just destitution or poverty, where you try to grow and overcome that and work hard and overcome that. But it's how it also more than physical barriers, there are multiple psychological barriers that work on you when you're growing up in conflict. So while it's brilliant that so many women are coming out, but there's also a lot of women who are not able to, who probably have gone from bad to worse in these years. So again, there's no homogeneous representation of how women have come up, but it's great that they are trying, which at my time was not even a possibility.
Thank you, Farah.
Thank you.
There is another question by Momil. I think if you can unmute and ask, please. I think you raised your hand.
Sure. Thank you, Shibani, and thanks, Farah, for being here. Thanks also to ARSD for organizing this. So what I'm going to say is going to be a mix of observations and a question towards the end. So thank you for that time. So I'm also from Kashmir, and I understand what you said about literature giving the writer more agency, because when we read about history, it's often about important people, and it's often sanitized, and usually along nationalistic lines. So every time I read something historical, and every time I read a literary representation of it or a literary response from artists, I see very different things, because history, more often than not, is like a biography of the famous. And then literature tends to be more about the common people. So what happens to a common person when they find themselves in events that are bigger than themselves? I also really appreciate that Farah didn't censor herself. So I think that's staying true to the kind of representation she wanted to bring about. Now, my question is about not so much about the content, but about the language. So I remember reading about Toni Morrison. She said that she doesn't translate for the white reader, in that she retains phrases that she feels assert her Black identity. I also realized that you retain a lot of Kashmiri phrases. And although you are writing in English, you are still asserting your Kashmiri identity. So I want to know if that was deliberate, if that was conscious, and how did you go about that? How did you choose what to retain and what to translate? Thank you.
Thank you, Momil. Thank you for reading the book and observing this important aspect, I would say, because, yeah, this was a conscious decision to retain the words, Kashmiri words, as a way to retain Kashmiriness, which is what we're also seeing, which I've been observing last few years, that Kashmiris and Kashmiri is sort of being, language is one of your main markers of one of the main markers of your identity. So, and if we see, like you rightly pointed out, Toni Morrison talks about, I mean, she doesn't translate. And then there is also in other literature that you see how, which are like different markers of identity, how they are sort of used and employed, adopted to retain that identity. And like Shibani and I were earlier speaking about how there is this, Kashmiris always have the sense of threat to their identity. And that could be the backdrop of this whole conscious decision, or the subconscious. That could be the subconscious aspect of retaining the words. Second is, when you read Amamanda Adichie and you see how she completely, in her third book, or whichever it's in the line, Americana, she completely owns her hair, and she talks about, she has chapters and chapters about hair and hairdressers and who flattens their hair, who relaxes, and she talks about, there's this entire politics of hair, right? So then there are different markers of identity, and whichever sort of helps at that point to retain that particular aspect of your identity. I think communities, people, races, ethnicities who have this, who have to grapple with this thing of retaining their identity or asserting their identity or resisting, find different markers. And for me, like you said, language was one of them. And it was a deliberate attempt to not have an explanation right next to it. Because then, and second, that is one aspect of it, which was sort of a conscious thing. And second is, when you grow up, when I was growing up especially, we spoke in Kashmiri at home, we speak in Kashmiri at home, and there were words of English interspersed. And when I had to write, it was the inverse of that, to be honest. It was me writing in English, and these words just came in naturally. So it's a conditioning, and second, it's a conscious decision because of what I spoke about.
Thank you for sharing that, Farah. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Momo.
Yes, Harsh, are there any more questions, or maybe we
Just two more questions, ma'am.
Maybe we'll just take a couple more and then we can wind up. Couple of quick questions, yeah, Harsh.
Sure, ma'am. The next one is from Harshita. She's asking, ma'am, can we expect a podcast for your memoir so that it can reach more people?
There is an audiobook which was just launched, so it is available. Basically, it got delayed because the person who was in charge of, at the publishers, who was in charge of making this audiobook, had COVID and was, literally, he just had a very bad COVID. So anyway, yeah, to your question, it is available on audiobook, so it should be ready.
And the last one is from Isha. Do you want your memoir to be a part of the historical narrative regarding Kashmir?
Do I want it to be a part? Sorry, your voice broke a bit. Is it written somewhere? Can I read it?
Did you want your memoir?
Yeah, if you want your memoir to be a part of the historical narrative of Kashmir, is what she's, I think, asking.
Do I want it?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's up to the reader to be writer, to be honest. That's up to the people who read it, and if they feel that it. For me, it definitely is a part of. It's an account of social history, for sure, because it also it doesn't only recount the experiences, but it also talks about a time which doesn't exist in Kashmir anymore, and a lot changed, and some things changed dramatically overnight. Some things took a few years. So part of social history, I would say, in the larger context of history, yeah, maybe, yeah. I don't think that's up to the writer.
Harsh, can we end with the questions now?
I will end that. And that was a wonderful chain of thoughts that Farah shared with us. And as indeed said, true, a session full of liberating thoughts is bound by limitation of time. And so soon, with reluctance, it's time to conclude this absolutely enriching conversation. So, hereby I, Harsh Kumar, on behalf of the English Association of Atma Ram Sanatan Dharma College and the allies present with us, would like to thank our honorable guest, Farah Bashir ma'am, for her esteemed presence with us and rewarding us with her precious time. Thank you, Farah ma'am. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Harsh.
I would also like to thank everybody who participated, all the colleagues and students and our principal for always sort of, encouraging us to, and standing by us whenever we organize any event. And Farah, thank you so much, not just for the conversation, but for your writing. I think many of us talked about, the reading of your memoirs triggering some, pretty traumatic sort of, events we ourselves have witnessed. But I would not look at it as a bad thing, and because I think, when you go through what we go through, that is what makes us who we are, and I think we are the stronger for it. And I think it's especially meaningful for me to have a woman reclaiming her space, reclaiming the narrative of Kashmir and what it means to be a Kashmiri girl. Okay, so I think that is my takeaway from your memoir. I don't think the trauma is what is, what I would sort of take, but what trauma does to you, how it can be an enabling force, how it can sort of heal us in some ways, writing and the importance of women's writing. I think that is something that I would take away from your memoir. So thank you. Thank you very much for doing this. Best wishes. What are you doing next? Are you doing some writing?
Thank you, Shivani. Thank you for this session. It's been a very interesting and engaging session. Yes, I'm working on a group portrait of Kashmiri women from 95 onwards. It spans across a decade. So it's actually a loose adaptation of Little Women set in Kashmir.
How wonderful. You're
because
waiting eagerly for it.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much to all your students and all the other faculty members for attending this session. Thank you.
Excellent session.
You, thank you very much for being there.
With that, I think we will come to an end. And I think, as has been our tradition, I think ask people, everybody who's present, to switch on their videos if possible and take a screenshot. Are you guys doing that? Thank you so much, people from the association. Thank you so much for putting up with my, request and, scolding and all of that. Thank you so much.